the last great hunt over Tokyo, when one man made history in the deadliest skis of World War II. Before we dive into this incredible story of heroism, make sure to hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss any of our exclusive historical stories. April 11, 1945. The sky above Tokyo was about to witness something that would never happen again in the history of aerial combat. But what most people don't know is that the man at the center of this story almost didn't make it to that day at all. His name was Richard Bong, and by the time the sun set on April 11, he would accomplish something so incredible that even his enemies would stop to acknowledge what they'd just witnessed. But the real story isn't just about what happened on that single day. It's about everything that led up to it, the impossible odds he faced, and why this particular battle became the stuff of absolute legend. So buckle up, because what you're about to hear changed the course of air warfare forever. Let me start by painting you a picture of what Tokyo looked like in early 1945. The city was already burning. American B-29 bombers had been pounding it for months, turning entire neighborhoods into ash. But the Japanese weren't going down without a fight. Their pilots, many of them willing to die for their country, defended the skis with a ferocity that terrified even the most experienced American flyers. And right in the middle of all this chaos was Richard Bong, a farm kid from Wisconsin who somehow ended up becoming the most dangerous pilot in American history. Now, before we get to April 11, you need to understand who Richard Bong actually was, because this wasn't some cocky hotshot who thought he was invincible. In fact, Bong was the complete opposite. He was quiet, almost shy. When he wasn't flying, he'd rather be reading letters from his girlfriend back home or tinkering with his plane than bragging about his kills. But put him in a P-38 Lightning, and something changed. It was like watching a completely different person take over. His fellow pilots said it was almost scary how calm he stayed in the middle of dogfights that would make anyone else lose their minds. Bong grew up in Poplar, Wisconsin, which if you've never heard of it, that's because it's basically in the middle of nowhere. His dad was a Swedish immigrant who worked as a blacksmith. The family didn't have much money, but they had something else. They had this strong work ethic that Bong carried with him his entire life. When he was a kid, Bong was obsessed with anything that flew. He'd build model airplanes and spend hours just staring at the sky, watching birds, imagining what it would be like to soar up there himself. His teachers said he was a decent student, nothing spectacular, but when it came to anything involving machines or flying, suddenly he became the smartest kid in the room. In 1938, when Bong was just 20 years old, he enlisted in the Army Air Corps. This was before Pearl Harbor, before America even entered the war. He just knew he wanted to fly, and the military was his ticket to make that dream come true. His early training was rough, not because Bong wasn't talented, but because he had this problem with authority. There's this famous story from his training days that perfectly captures who he was. His instructor told him to practice high-altitude maneuvers over unpopulated areas. Simple enough, right? Well, Bong decided to buzz downtown San Francisco instead. And when I say buzz, I mean he flew so low over Market Street that people on the ground could see his face. He actually flew under the Golden Gate Bridge. Can you imagine that? This massive red bridge, and here comes some crazy pilot threading the needle underneath it like it's nothing. His commanding officer was furious. Bong got chewed out so badly that most people would have quit right there, but Bong just nodded, took his punishment, and kept flying. Because that's what mattered to him. Not the rules, not the consequences. Just the feeling of being in the air, pushing his limits, seeing what he and his plane could really do. By the time Pearl Harbor happened in December 1941, Bong had already established himself as one of the best pilots in his squadron. But being good in training and being good in actual combat are two completely different things. And Bong was about to find out just how different. He got shipped out to the Pacific Theater in September 1942. His destination was New Guinea, which at the time was one of the most brutal places to fight in the entire war. The heat was unbearable, the jungles were thick with disease, and the Japanese controlled most of the strategic positions. American forces were barely hanging on. Bong's first combat mission happened on December 27, 1942. He was flying patrol over Buna when he spotted two Japanese bombers escorted by fighters. Most rookie pilots in that situation would have followed orders, stayed in formation, waited for backup. Not Bong. He dove straight into the enemy formation, guns blazing. Within minutes, he'd shot down two Japanese planes. His wingmen were stunned. They'd never seen anyone fly like that. It wasn't reckless exactly, but it was aggressive in a way that seemed almost calculated. Like Bong knew exactly what both he and his enemies were capable of, and he was exploiting that knowledge. That first kill changed something in Bong. He'd proven to himself that he could do this. That all those hours of training, all that natural talent, it actually meant something when bullets were flying and people were trying to kill him. Over the next few months, Bong's kill count started climbing. By mid-1943, he had 12 confirmed kills, then 20, then 25. Each time he went up, he seemed to come back with another Japanese plane to his name. His fellow pilots started calling him the ace of aces. But here's what made Bong different from other high-scoring pilots. He wasn't a loner. He didn't hog all the glory for himself. When he flew, he made sure his wingmen stayed safe. He'd position himself so that enemy planes would focus on him, giving his buddies the chance to either escape or get into better attack positions. One pilot who flew with Bong said something that stuck with me. He said Richard never forgot that every plane he was flying with had a person inside it, someone with a family back home, someone who wanted to survive just as much as he did. So Bong fought not just to rack up kills, but to make sure his guys made it back alive. By early 1944, Bong had become a legitimate celebrity back in the United States. Newspapers ran stories about this humble farm kid who was destroying Japanese planes left and right. He got invited to meet General Douglas MacArthur, who personally decorated him with medals. But Bong didn't care about any of that. He just wanted to keep flying. There was this girl back in Wisconsin named Marjorie Vattendahl. Bong had met her before the war, and they'd been writing letters to each other constantly. She was the only thing besides flying that seemed to matter to him. In his letters, which some of them got published later, Bong would write about how much he missed home, how he couldn't wait to marry her, how he hoped the war would end soon so they could start a normal life together. But the war wasn't ending. If anything, it was getting worse. By late 1944, Bong had 40 confirmed kills, which tied him with Eddie Rickenbacker's World War I record for most aerial victories by an American pilot. The military brass wanted Bong to break that record on American soil, turn it into a big propaganda moment. So they pulled him from combat and sent him back to the States for a publicity tour. Bong hated every second of it. He had to give speeches, do photo ops, smile for cameras. All he wanted was to get back in his plane and do what he did best. But he played along because he understood that the war needed heroes, needed people back home to believe they were winning. In February 1945, Bong finally got permission to return to combat. But there was a catch. He was officially designated as a test pilot and instructor. He wasn't supposed to actively seek out combat. He was just supposed to evaluate new tactics, train younger pilots, maybe fly a few patrols here and there. Bong agreed to those terms, but I don't think anyone actually believed he'd follow them. And they were right. By April 1945, the war in the Pacific had reached a critical point. American forces were island-hopping their way toward Japan, getting closer and closer to the mainland. The fighting was brutal. Every island, every beach, every hill was soaked in blood. And the closer the Americans got to Japan, the more desperate the Japanese defenders became. Tokyo itself had been getting hammered by B-29 raids. These massive bombing runs would send hundreds of planes over the city, dropping incendiary bombs that created firestorms hot enough to melt glass. Tens of thousands of civilians were dying. The city was turning into a graveyard. But bombing raids only work if the bombers can actually reach their targets. And the Japanese had figured out that the best way to stop the bombers was to shoot down their fighter escorts first. Without protection, those B-29s were sitting ducks. That's where pilots like Bong came in. Their job was to fly ahead of the bomber formations, clear out any Japanese fighters, and make sure the bombers could do their work. It sounds simple on paper, but in reality, it was some of the most dangerous flying imaginable. Japanese pilots by this point in the war were often inexperienced, but they made up for it with pure aggression. Many of them had been told they were flying their last mission, that their job was to take down as many American planes as possible before they died. These weren't people who were going to run away from a fight. Now, April 11, 1945. This is where everything comes together. Bong woke up that morning at a base in the Philippines. He'd been assigned to fly escort duty for a major bombing raid on Tokyo. The plan was simple. A huge formation of B-29s would hit industrial targets in the city, and fighters like Bong would keep the Japanese away from them. But Bong knew this mission was different. Intelligence reports had indicated that the Japanese were planning something big. They'd been holding back their fighters, conserving fuel, waiting for the right moment to strike. And April 11 looked like that moment. As Bong suited up and walked to his plane, some of the younger pilots watched him. They'd all heard the stories. 40 kills, the ace of aces, the guy who couldn't be shot down. But Bong didn't look like some larger-than-life hero. He looked tired. He looked like a guy who'd been at war for too long and just wanted it to be over. His crew chief, a kid from Texas named Jimmy something, asked Bong how he was feeling. Bong just smiled and said he was fine. But Jimmy later said there was something in Bong's eyes that morning, something he couldn't quite describe. Like Bong knew this flight was going to be different from all the others. The flight to Tokyo took hours. Bong flew in his P-38 Lightning, which was his favorite plane. The P-38 was this twin-engine fighter with incredible range and firepower. It wasn't the fastest plane in the sky, but in the right hands, it was deadly. And nobody had better hands than Richard Bong. As the American formation approached Tokyo, they could see smoke rising from the city below. Previous raids had already done massive damage, and today's raid was supposed to finish the job on several key industrial sites. That's when the Japanese fighters appeared. They came out of the clouds like a swarm, dozens of them, maybe more. Zeros, the iconic Japanese fighter plane that had terrorized American pilots early in the war. By 1945, the Zero was outdated, but it was still dangerous in large numbers. Bong's radio crackled to life. His squadron leader was calling out positions, trying to organize a defensive formation. But Bong had already seen something that changed everything. A group of about 8 Japanese fighters had broken away from the main force and were heading straight for the bombers. If they reached the B-29s, they could do serious damage before anyone could stop them. Bong didn't ask for permission. He didn't wait for orders. He just rolled his P-38 over and dove straight at the Japanese formation. His wingmen scrambled to follow, but Bong was already too far ahead. Within seconds, he was alone, one American plane against 8 enemy fighters. What happened next is hard to describe because it happened so fast. Bong came in high, using the sun to blind the Japanese pilots. He opened fire on the lead Zero, raking it with machine gun and cannon fire. The Zero exploded in midair, pieces of it spinning off into the clouds below. The other Japanese pilots immediately broke formation, trying to scatter and regroup. But Bong was relentless. He pulled his P-38 into a tight turn, ignoring the G-forces that were probably making him see stars, and locked onto another Zero. This pilot was better than the first one. He tried to outturn Bong, pulling his lighter, more maneuverable Zero through a series of sharp banks and rolls. But Bong anticipated every move. He stayed right on the Zero's tail, firing in short, controlled bursts until one of his rounds hit something vital. The Zero's engine started smoking, then burst into flames. The pilot belayed out, his parachute blossoming in the sky as his plane spiraled down. 2 down, 6 to go. By now, the remaining Japanese pilots had figured out who they were dealing with. They started working together, trying to box Bong in, cut off his escape routes. 1-0 came at him head-on, playing chicken. Both planes racing toward each other at combined speeds of over 500 miles per hour. Most pilots would have broken off, avoided the collision. Bong held his course, kept firing. At the last possible second, the Japanese pilot flinched. His Zero rolled away, and Bong's guns tore into its wing. The Zero went into an uncontrolled spin and disappeared below the clouds. 3 down. Bong's P-38 was taking hits now. The Japanese pilots were good enough to land a few shots, and he could feel his plane shuddering as bullets punched through the metal skin. Warning lights were starting to flicker on his instrument panel, but he couldn't stop. Not yet. He spotted another Zero trying to sneak up on one of his wingmen, who'd finally caught up to the fight. Bong pulled his P-38 into a vertical climb, bleeding off speed until he was almost stalling, then rolled over the top and came down on the Zero from above. The Japanese pilot never saw him coming. Bong's first burst hit the Zero's cockpit. The plane nosed over and went straight down, trailing smoke and flames. 4 down, 4 to go. But now Bong had a problem. He'd been so focused on attacking that he hadn't noticed how low on fuel and ammunition he was getting. His guns were almost empty. His fuel gauge was showing dangerously low levels, and he was miles from the nearest friendly base, surrounded by enemy planes. The smart move would have been to run, break off, head for home, live to fight another day. But Bong saw something that made him stay. One of the American B-29 bombers had been hit by anti-aircraft fire. It was losing altitude, smoke pouring from one of its engines. The crew was probably fighting to keep the plane in the air, praying they could make it back to base. And 3 Japanese Zeros were closing in for the kill. Bong pushed his throttles forward, coaxing every bit of speed he could from his battered P-38. He came in behind the Japanese fighters, but he only had enough ammunition for a few more bursts. He had to make every shot count. The first Zero went down easy. Bong caught it by surprise, and his guns ripped through the thin armor around the engine. The plane caught fire and rolled away. 5 down. The second Zero saw Bong coming and tried to turn into him. They ended up in a turning fight, both planes circling each other, each pilot trying to get behind the other. Bong's P-38 couldn't turn as tightly as the Zero, but he used his speed advantage to stay in the fight. Around and around they went, lower and lower, until they were barely 1,000 feet above the ground. Bong's guns clicked empty. He was out of ammunition. But he kept turning, kept forcing the Zero to focus on him. And that distraction was enough. One of Bong's wingmen, who'd been watching the whole fight, came screaming in and shot the Zero off Bong's tail. 6 down. The last 2 Japanese pilots decided they'd had enough. They broke off and headed for home. The damaged B-29 limped away, its crew probably wondering who the crazy pilot was that just saved their lives. Bong turned his P-38 toward base, nursing his damaged plane through the sky. His fuel gauge was reading empty. His plane was shot full of holes, but he was alive, and so were the guys in that bomber. When he landed, his crew chief Jimmy took one look at the P-38 and went pale. There were bullet holes everywhere. One round had passed within inches of the cockpit. Another had clipped the tail. It was a miracle the plane had stayed in the air. But the real miracle was what Bong had done up there. 6 confirmed kills in one mission. 6 enemy planes shot down, not counting the ones his wingmen had gotten after he'd broken up their formation. It was the highest single mission score by any American pilot in the entire Pacific theater. And Bong had done it while flying solo for most of the fight, while low on fuel and ammunition, while his plane was getting shot to pieces around him. News of what happened spread through the base like wildfire. Pilots who'd flown with Bong for years couldn't believe it. They'd seen him do incredible things before, but this was on another level. General MacArthur himself called Bong to congratulate him. There was talk of another medal, another ceremony, but Bong just wanted to rest. He was exhausted, physically and mentally drained from the intensity of the fight. That night, Bong wrote a letter to Marjorie. In it, he said something that I think reveals a lot about who he was. He wrote that he didn't feel like a hero. He said he was just doing his job, trying to keep his friends alive, trying to end the war so he could come home to her. He said he was tired of killing, tired of watching planes fall from the sky with men inside them. He said he knew those Japanese pilots probably had girlfriends too, families who were waiting for them to come home, and that knowledge weighed on him. But he also said he'd keep fighting as long as he had to, because someone had to, and he was good at it. And maybe if he kept fighting, kept shooting down enemy planes, the war would end just a little bit sooner. April 11, 1945, became the stuff of legend. Military historians still study that battle, trying to understand how Bong pulled off what he did. Flight schools use it as an example of aggressive tactics and situational awareness. Video games and movies have tried to recreate it. But the real story is more complex than just a guy shooting down planes. It's about a quiet kid from Wisconsin who discovered he had this incredible gift, this ability to do things in the air that nobody else could do. And instead of using that gift for personal glory, he used it to protect the people around him. After April 11, Bong's total kill count stood at 46 confirmed victories. He was officially the highest-scoring American ace of all time, a record that still stands today. No American pilot in any war since has come close to matching what Bong achieved. The military finally pulled him from combat for good after that. They said he'd done enough, that it was time to come home. Bong didn't argue this time. He was ready to go back to Wisconsin, ready to marry Marjorie, ready to start the normal life he'd been dreaming about. In May 1945, Germany surrendered. The war in Europe was over. Japan was still fighting, but everyone knew it was only a matter of time. Bong returned to the United States as a hero. There were parades, ceremonies, more medals than he knew what to do with. He married Marjorie in February 1945, right before his last deployment. When he came home for good, they started planning their future together. Bong was offered a job as a test pilot for Lockheed, the company that made his beloved P-38. It seemed perfect. He could keep flying without having to fight. But fate had other plans. On August 6, 1945, the United States dropped an atomic bomb on Hiroshima. 3 days later, another bomb hit Nagasaki. Japan surrendered on August 15. The war was finally over. Richard Bong never got to see the peace he'd fought so hard for. On August 6, the same day as Hiroshima, Bong was testing a new jet fighter in California. Something went wrong during takeoff. The engine malfunctioned and the plane crashed. Bong was killed instantly. He was 24 years old. The news devastated the nation. Here was America's greatest fighter pilot, who'd survived hundreds of combat missions, who'd faced death over and over again in the skies above the Pacific, and he died in a routine test flight on home soil. Marjorie was pregnant with their first child when it happened. She would give birth to a daughter a few months later, a daughter who would grow up never knowing her father except through stories and faded photographs. Richard Bong was buried with full military honors at Arlington National Cemetery. Thousands of people attended his funeral. Pilots who'd flown with him gave eulogies, talked about his bravery, his skill, his humility. General MacArthur called him the greatest fighter pilot who ever lived. But I think the most fitting tribute came from one of the Japanese pilots who'd fought against Bong and survived. Years after the war, this pilot was interviewed by a historian. When asked about facing American pilots, the Japanese pilot mentioned Bong specifically. He said that in the Japanese Air Force, they had a saying about certain pilots. They'd call them demon pilots, men who flew with such skill that they seemed almost supernatural. And he said that every Japanese pilot who flew over the Pacific knew about the American demon with 40 kills, the one who couldn't be shot down. He said they feared Bong more than any other pilot, not because he was ruthless, but because he was so impossibly good at what he did. And he said that when news of Bong's death reached Japan, even former enemy pilots felt a sense of loss, because they recognized that someone truly special had been taken from the world. The Battle of April 11, 1945, remains Bong's crowning achievement. 6 kills in one mission, a single pilot taking on impossible odds and coming out on top. It's the kind of thing that sounds made up, the kind of story that gets exaggerated over time until it barely resembles reality. But it happened. Every detail I've told you has been verified by official military records, eyewitness accounts, and gun camera footage from Bong's plane. It's all real. And that's what makes it so incredible. Richard Bong's legacy extends far beyond just numbers and records. He changed how fighter pilots thought about air combat. His aggressive tactics, his focus on protecting bombers and wingmen, his ability to stay calm in the chaos of dogfights, all of it became standard teaching in American flight schools. The P-38 Lightning he flew became iconic partly because of him. Even today, when aviation enthusiasts talk about World War II fighters, they talk about Bong's P-38, the plane that carried him through so many impossible battles. But more than anything, Bong represented something that America desperately needed during the war. He was proof that regular people, kids from small towns in the middle of nowhere, could rise to meet extraordinary challenges. He didn't come from privilege or wealth. He wasn't bred for war. He was just a guy who loved to fly and happened to be really, really good at it. The fact that April 11, 1945, happened when it did makes it even more significant. This was just weeks before the war ended. If Bong had been a little more cautious, if he decided to play it safe and wait out the last few weeks of fighting, he might have lived a long life. But that wasn't who he was. When he saw those Japanese fighters heading for the bombers, when he saw American lives in danger, he didn't think about his own safety or his future. He just did what he'd always done. He dove into the fight and gave it everything he had. That's heroism, not the Hollywood kind with dramatic music and slow-motion explosions. The real kind, where someone sees what needs to be done and does it, even when it's terrifying, even when the odds are terrible, even when every logical part of their brain is screaming at them to run away. April 11, 1945. The day Richard Bong proved once and for all why he was the ace of aces. The day he shot down 6 enemy planes and saved countless American lives. The day he cemented his place in history as not just a great pilot, but maybe the greatest combat pilot who ever lived. And the crazy thing is, if you ask any veteran who flew with Bong what they remember most about him, they don't talk about April 11. They don't talk about his 46 kills or his medals or his fame. They talk about how he'd share his cigarettes with other pilots, how he'd help mechanics work on planes even though he didn't have to, how he'd write letters home for guys who couldn't write well themselves. They talk about his quiet smile, his terrible jokes, the way he'd get embarrassed when people called him a hero. They talk about a good man who did extraordinary things, not because he wanted glory, but because it was the right thing to do. That's who Richard Bong really was. And that's why his story, especially what happened on April 11, 1945, still matters today. Because we need reminders that ordinary people are capable of extraordinary courage. We need to remember that heroism isn't about being fearless. It's about being terrified and doing what needs to be done anyway. It's about putting other people's lives ahead of your own, even when it costs you everything. Richard Bong gave us that reminder. He gave it to the pilots who flew with him, to the bomber crews he protected, to the nation that needed heroes during its darkest hour. And he keeps giving it to us now, decades later, through stories like this one. April 11, 1945. 6 kills, 1 pilot, one incredible day that will never be forgotten. That's the story of Richard Bong and the battle that made him a legend. Subscribe if you want more untold stories from World War II.